that quick off the mark, you know, and she
Yeah.
said, well, I think it's because I know him through the Child Development Center. It was Linda McLean.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay, 30 seconds. Yeah, no, I've just gotten, spent all week just getting caught up and. All right. All right, thanks very much. And thanks everybody who is tuning in to watch us for the City of Courtenay's Finance Select Committee on January 15th. It's 11 a.m. And I just want to acknowledge that we are meeting and Zooming on the traditional unceded territories of the Comox First Nation. And just wanted to really give some opening remarks on the last year. It's been about a year since we had our last Finance Selects Committee meeting. And this is something that I think was a big priority for Council to really dig into some of the financial issues that we were having and looking to the future. And then obviously the pandemic hit, COVID-19, and that really impacted us just from the ability to have meetings, but really impacted us from a finance perspective, not knowing how the COVID-19 was going to affect people's ability to pay their taxes, how it was going to affect our ability to do operations, so the projects that we had in the pipe. And so, you know, what we've been able to do over the last year is really kind of get a better sense of where things are at. And again, it's not a perfect place to be, but there's lots of stuff going on. We've also had the Economic Recovery Task Force that was struck last year that kind of at a regional level for the Comox Valley tried to create some of that leadership and guidance and really help the different municipalities work together. You know, as we move forward, I just, again, really want to thank everybody who is part of the Finance Committee. I think it is still a very important place, and probably even more important than it was a year or two ago. So with that, I think I will cede the chair over to Councillor Hillian, who's the chair of the Finance Committee.
Thank you, Mayor. Thanks very much, Mayor Wells. Appreciate those opening remarks, and it's good to see everybody here today. Thanks to staff who are present, along with Councillors Cole Hamilton and McCollum. And the opening remarks having been made, we'll bring this meeting to order and start with, everyone has the agenda. We'll start with the adoption of minutes from February 10th, 2020.
Second.
Move McCollum, second Cole Hamilton. Any discussion? All those in favor? Carried unanimously. And we have no late items. We have no delegations, so we'll move right into staff reports and presentations. And just before I ask our Director of Finance, Jennifer Nelson, to present this report, I might say that, as the Mayor acknowledged, it has been a year since we've met, and we're probably going to need a mini refresher on some of the issues and processes that we've been talking about. And so I just welcome you to ask any questions of our staff that you may have, both as we address the agenda today and as we consider moving this process forward. And with that, we'll turn it over to Jennifer. And I'll just remind everybody that our technical people have said that even though the mics are on, please speak up to make sure that it transmits to the feed.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Hillian. So this report that I've drafted is a recommended report that is intended to eventually come to Council, and so I drafted it with that intent and for your review at the committee. Essentially, what I'm doing here is we're bringing forward a proposed use of the COVID-19 Restart grant funds. So the city received $4.1 million in November of 2020, and originally when those funds were received, there was a brief letter received by the minister that outlined the uses of the funds, but it was quite general, and we were still waiting for some more details in terms of exactly what we could use those funds for. So there were lots of questions from chief financial officers around BC inquiring about the extent to which those funds could be used, and a committee was formed within the Government Finance Officers Association, and they were relaying general questions through to the province. And in late December, early January, financial officers received a summary of responses to all those questions. So that helped guide this recommendation and how we could use those funds. So waiting on that, as well as with the intention that we also have to be aware that we have to report on the use too. So we were getting some answers from the province around how the reporting would look. So really, some of those main items to keep in mind that the province has identified for us is that this is a liquidity infusion to support and provide essential services through COVID. So it is for operating expenses, and it's to help municipalities deal with the losses in revenues and some of the increased expenses that come along with that. And so a few things that they've answered for us is around the fact that they don't want to see these funds used to just artificially reduce taxation, to bring the tax rate to an amount that's not sustainable. As well as they anticipate that municipalities are going to use this up within the next couple of years. So it's not intended to be hang on to the money and wait for down the road past COVID. So they say that 2020, 2021 is when it will mainly be used, and possibly 2022 as well. And so based on that information that's come back, and how we're going to have to report on it, it's really recommended to use this for large items, be able to, clearly identify and be sure that we can report back, and that the use is within those intended areas. So what I've done is I've taken the amount we have here and I've put it on page 13 of your agenda, just created a proposed summary of how we might want to use those funds in 2020 and 2021. So some of the big impacts that the city saw in 2020, as well as we're still experiencing into 2021, is our loss of gaming revenue, as well as recreation and investment losses. So what I'm recommending is that we take a look at those losses in the gaming fund, and we consider paying back that to the fund in 2020. So that's in the 2020 fiscal year. As well as recognizing those losses we experienced on the recreation side and taking in the revenue around that and bringing it into 2020. So essentially taking in about half of the money in the 2020 fiscal year and then hanging on to the rest for the 2021 fiscal year and incorporating that within our operating financial planning that's happening as we speak. So we know that when COVID hit, we adjusted our operations and we reduced our expenses to make sure that we weren't going to go over budget. And so there may be some savings as we compile the 2020 year end, but ultimately bringing these funds into 2020 will ultimately, if there is any additional surplus, it will roll into our prior year surplus, and then council will be able to utilize those funds in other ways as they move forward in the financial planning. So as you can see, in 2020, I've outlined that recommended use, and then in 2021, we're anticipating we'll see similar losses in the gaming fund. So again, reserving some money to pay back the fund, and specifically identifying using towards the policing and infrastructure reserve, and leaving about $550,000 for potential further losses in recreation, and then reserving $100,000 for City Hall renovations to allow for reopening, and setting aside $84,000 for additional bylaw enforcement support, which we know is allowed within the use of those funds.
Could you just clarify, it sounds like that's not capital, but operational
It's
costs?
operational,
Yes.
yeah. So the intent of these funds are generally for operating expenses, but they've identified that for specific cases, there's a few capital if it relates directly to specific supporting the vulnerable or reopening of facilities.
And that's where we get to our next item, which I think we're particularly interested in.
Yeah, so we've identified $200,000 here to set aside to support the washroom in downtown, which I believe council reviewed a recommendation or a report previously by our Public Works Director, and it identified that it would support the public as well as vulnerable downtown, and so we identified that we could potentially use some of these funds to support that. Within the Restart grant, it does say that we could use those funds for vulnerable. So I feel confident that that would be a suitable project to use those funds for, but I have sent a formal inquiry through to the province just to be sure, just so we can get that confirmation, because it is a capital item. But I do feel that I would be comfortable putting that within the financial plan. I have confirmed that that will not impact any of this. We can, those funds will receive those. So it was about 90,000 in total that we were able to recover. One of the reasons why I didn't include all the one-off expenses in here is because it does get very cumbersome in terms of reporting. So where you choose to highlight why we're bringing those funds in and for reporting purposes, I'm recommending this method, but yes, we were able to recover some of those costs.
Excellent. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Jennifer. Councillor McCollum?
Thanks, Chair, and thanks for the report, Jennifer. I think my first question is just around how we're going to use the revenue shortfall money in the 2020. I would assume that if we were not going to take that $1.5 million and assign it to Parks and Rec, if we had a different use for it, it will, I'm just trying to think of the best way to formulate this. So the last time we looked at where recreation had landed, the revenue was about equally impacted to the operational savings from closures. Is that is that still roughly where, you expect things to land?
So that's in reference to the update we gave council, I believe in October, where we were estimating, and that was correct. We anticipated that the net loss would be within the same as the net loss in revenue. We were going to reduce expenses by the same amount, so there wouldn't be an overall net impact on the entire budget. We're still working on wrapping up year end. We've still got a lot of invoices flowing in. I'm going to say it's a little bit, there's a little bit more of a loss than we anticipated, because we thought services were going to continue on to the end of the year, which they didn't.
Right.
So we're still trying to reconcile that. At the end of the day, I can't speak to the actual value at this point. It won't be the full 1.5 million. That's for sure. But still anticipating at this point, without, wrapping up our whole year end, that we would come out being able to manage the losses overall within our budget in 2020.
So the like net consequence of assigning the 1.5 to revenue shortfall would likely be unspent surplus going into 2021, is that?
That's the intent. Again, without getting the full year end done, and we're so soon into that process, I wouldn't want to say for sure it's 100%, but the significant portion of it would fall into surplus, and then we're not as regulated as to how those funds could be used.
That makes sense. And so, like, would there be a further process in looking at that? And like, say, I mean, I recognize that we're kind of in an estimating phase of the process, because we don't have hard numbers at this point, but say, for example, of this amount, we are able to increase the unspent surplus by, say, $1 million. What would, like, I mean, it's been a while since we've looked at any budget numbers. Is that a pretty significant impact to unspent surplus? Like, what do you recall roughly what it was last year?
Yeah, I believe we went into the financial planning process with about $2 million of prior year surplus that we were able to use across the 5-year plan. So this, we'd be pushing up into $4 million. You'll recall when COVID first hit, there was a lot of concern about cash flow, and so then we were really grateful to have that $2 million there that was our working capital. So any amount that does fall into surplus relating to this, we would account for that and then be able to highlight it in the 2021 financial plan as to how this contributed to the surplus, and then how it's being utilized in other ways throughout the financial plan.
Yeah, that's great. That's a more significant proportion of unspent surplus than I was imagining. That's pretty impactful if that's where it goes. So, yeah, having further conversation about what that, what the possibilities are would be useful, I think. I have some other stuff too, but I'll just let us continue around.
Fair enough. Councillor Cole-Hamilton, any feedback on the staff report?
Yeah, thanks, Chair, and thanks so much for this. This is really enlightening to get a sense of where we stand and what we can be doing with these funds. And I had thoughts similar to Councillor McCollum. I was, if I recall, there was roughly in October a balance between the savings and the loss of revenue in rec, and it sounds like it's not going to come out quite as positively as that, but there'll be still some significant funds in unspent surplus. And just on, I just grabbed this quote from page 9 of the report. It said, any surplus resulting from utilizing these funds in 2020 would ultimately end up in the city's prior year surplus and become available for use in 21 to 25 financial plan at council's discretion. And I'm just wondering what process there would be for council making that sort of consideration, because that seems like that's the set of decisions that would follow if we were to adopt this, would be to consider how to best use this increased surplus. So what's the process for council making that kind of decision process?
Yeah, so that would be through the budget process. So that's when we bring forward the general operating and capital plans, you would see, you know, that may be opportunity to utilize to then reduce a taxation revenue or to fund another capital or operating item that maybe wasn't in the previous financial plan or just support. So so ultimately, when the draft operating and capital financial plans come forward for consideration, we would identify for you how much prior year surplus is recommended to use to support that and keep other revenues in line, as well as normally what we do when we bring it forward, you'll just see a one line item of prior year surplus used. For this specific situation, because of this is so separate from everything else, we could keep this as a separate line item for you, so you could see, okay, this is how much ultimately was related to the restart funds that we brought into revenue, and then we could go as far as to identify exactly what items are attributed to that or being funded by. But in terms of what we want to do is make sure that we can utilize these funds for appropriate reasons as soon as possible, right, for reporting purposes. So if we hold it in a reserve and we wait for costs that are directly related to COVID, it may be more challenging to assign that throughout future years too. So.
Okay, and I can see the wisdom of doing it this way because it allows them to be utilized in 2020 and 2021, which is the time frame the provincial government's looking for. Then the surplus is something which we could consider over time. If this were to be approved by council, these recommendations, would it be possible to have fairly shortly after that a session where we consider what's to do with that, what the purposes might be for that line item, rather than folding it into the budget process, just so that if there are particular suggestions or ideas, they could be incorporated earlier on in the process?
I guess I'm just thinking in terms of capacity of budget. Like we're really right now, we're not only in budget, we're in audit as well. Like we're in year end as well, and so there's a lot happening to even prepare that initial look at the budget. Mm-hmm. So I'm thinking. I don't know if our interim CAO. Do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, thank you, through Chair Hillian. I think the critical first step is the audit, and then we'll know our year end, and that will really give us that clarity on the surplus. Mm-hmm. I suspect shortly after that, we can come back and have a meeting. Yeah, I think this year, because of COVID, because of the restart funds, I think it's going to be important that we have a number of meetings for the budget, so that there's a lot of time to digest and make those kind of decisions. Typically, we would do the general operating and capital in one night, and of course for staff, we've talked about this, that's a very overwhelming night. It's a long night for council as well, so we're putting our minds to potentially having a series of maybe a couple days where we can really get into the nuts and bolts. I think this year in particular, because of COVID, its impact of the revenues and shortfalls, and once that information becomes apparent, I think we'll come back to council with a schedule, some meetings to satisfy some of the higher level detail that council wants.
Okay, great. That's those are the initial questions I had, so I'll just pass it on to see if anyone else has any.
Thanks, Councillor Cole-Hamilton. Mayor Wells.
Did you have any questions?
That's fine. You carry on.
Well, mine's not so much a question. I don't think it's a question. I think it's more of wearing the other hat that I have in this room, and that's really looking at those meetings, dates where we don't have council meetings. That and I think that's how we got some of those public hearings in. But maybe looking at those Mondays where we don't have a council meeting and utilizing them for so we don't again try to reduce those very long days so we can keep fresh and make better decisions. So that was it.
Thanks. And so just a couple of clarifications, if I could, from our finance director. So am I correct in understanding that we can't apply the province's COVID funds to alleviate the tax burden directly? But if the use of those funds results in us having an additional surplus for a future year, we could apply those to reduce the tax burden.
That's correct.
And that's totally legitimate from the province's perspective, is it?
The province has identified that we need to attach a schedule to our financial statements and confirm that the use of the funds is being utilized for their list of items they've said. And on that list is revenue losses, and all we need to do for revenue losses is prove actual versus budget loss. And it doesn't ask, they don't tell you that you need to look at overall what your overall net surplus was for the year. So you have to make sure that you're bringing it in for those purposes and being able to report on that. So based on all the information that I've gathered and discussions I've had with other finance officers, that approach is appropriate.
That's great news. I did want to clarify the mayor's earlier question related to the aid that the city provided in the early days of COVID, and in particular with regards to the warming center, where I believe there have been some costs related to upgrades of the systems there, and there may be some future costs as well. Are you saying that those costs are in fact covered within the existing Public Works budget, or that they were reimbursed by the emergency funds, or are we in fact looking at the possibility that the 200,000 could be applied to those?
So my understanding, any costs that the city incurred in terms of bringing the warming facility to where it needed to be was absorbed within our current year or 2020 operating budget. So that's fine. There would have been lots of different, labor, supplier invoices, whatever, related to those. There were also some funds paid from gaming to support in the early days. Because that was paid directly out of the gaming fund to those societies, we wouldn't necessarily be able to cover with these funds now, but going forward, a situation like that would be supported within the use of these funds. So if we had had them at that time, we could have paid from our general. So the intent of paying back the gaming fund is helping to offset those losses within that fund. But if that were to happen right now, I would have suggested that you use a portion of your $200,000 set aside here of the restart funds to make that payment, as long as it was to a society and confirming that it was for the vulnerable.
All right, and not getting too far ahead of ourselves, but and I'll turn over to Trevor.
Oh, yeah. Thank you, Chair Helene. Jennifer, I don't have the exact dates in my head, but I know that when the province shifted from phase 1 COVID to what they deemed as recovery, that's essentially when a lot of the funding stopped for us to be able to put the applications in to be reimbursed. And I don't know that exact date, but we were notified, and we tried to scramble together and put all our invoices in, and then they shut that response funding down.
Fair enough. Yeah, the last thing I was going to ask, I know that on our agenda, our upcoming agenda for council on Monday, we have Lush Valley coming forward, essentially asking for money for their food program, which I believe is related to the circumstances of the community and the pandemic. You're probably going to get asked on Monday, if not now, if these funds could in fact be applied to something like that.
Yeah, so I did look at the agenda and I read over the request. Based on what I could tell from that, it's going towards a vulnerable situation, and so essentially these funds could be used towards that kind of a ask. So if I was asked, based on that, I can see that it would qualify. So I would point to this $200,000 would be where I could see that may fall under. Just keeping in mind too that that's the amount for any other unexpected items that may come up. I believe I noticed that there's been some other jurisdictions locally that have made payment to the Comox Valley Community Foundation to support that kind of initiative. So it could be that instead of direct, it goes through a foundation that supports the reporting requirements too.
Sure. And I think we have to be careful in that, as you know, councillors are very, like myself, are very quick to develop wish lists, and word gets out that the city has money. I think we have to be very careful that this extra 200,000 is not spent without a fair amount of thought and anticipation of what may come up with the city's actual costs. Mayor Wells?
And I'll just respond, and we'll probably have a more fulsome discussion on Monday, but I think just in terms of Lush as well as making sure that all local governments are pitching in, and I think that Courtney has really stepped up and potentially given a little bit more than its share, and I think that's a reflection of our council, but also the expectation that, again, some of those monies that we're putting out, we'd be reimbursed from the province, but making sure on Monday that when we're talking with Lush that the requests and those asks are distributed throughout the entire community, I think is a fair thing. So
Yeah, for certain, for certain. Any further comments on Director Nelson's report?
I have just a couple little questions left, if that's all right.
Go ahead.
I'm wondering if much thought was given to like stretching out some of these operational costs over more than one fiscal, like specifically the bylaw enforcement support, or even tacking on, I know when we saw the report for the public washrooms, I think there's like 30 or 40,000 a year in operational costs for cleaning and maintenance, and whether or not it would be an appropriate use of funds to try and, you know, spread some of this money out a little further on the horizon. And I'm not sure how firm you feel that directive is around the 2021 versus 2022, but yeah, just curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I guess my only concern is that ultimately we have to tie it back to the pandemic and ongoing operating costs for something that maybe was established during the pandemic, but the pandemic's not happening anymore. It may be challenging from a reporting perspective to say that we're still going to claim back the operating of the washroom, even though we're not in the pandemic anymore. So that would be my only concern, is that we may run out of good legitimate reasons to utilize it, and then it's sitting there and we're not able to find a way to take it into our revenue. So things like, you know, yes, the washroom may have ongoing costs. Well, that's where this prior year surplus could help us to offset some of those costs into the future. Was there another example of a future cost that may want to consider?
The bylaw and the bathroom was the two
Yeah.
that came to my mind.
Yeah, so again, with the bylaw, it could be argued, you know, we need additional bylaw support in 2021, but when the pandemic is over, then how do we justify still reporting and using that money? Whereas, okay, we have a little extra in our surplus because we brought it in when the pandemic was happening, and we can, so maybe that's something we could build into our budget process, so that could be identified how, okay, and we're going to keep the surplus aside from this year to help with some of those costs that fall out of those additional capital or operating we'd had to take on, and we're going to keep as we move ahead. So
Yeah, that makes good sense. It gives us a little bit more decision-making flexibility and moving it in that way.
Comment from Trevor?
Yeah, thank you, Chair Hanley. Yeah, just a comment around the washrooms. By the time we order the unit, well, by the time we do a budget process, get approval, order the unit, do the construction and service, we're probably looking at probably fall of 2021 anyway, so our operational impact will be quite small for 2021. We'll really see it in 2022. And in terms of the addition of bylaw enforcement help, once these funds are utilized, then to Jennifer's point, either surplus, prior to surplus, or general taxation will be required to fund that position if we deem it necessary ongoing. We recognize that, but I think we also recognize that we do need some bylaw enforcement capacity for sure, you know, considering that the facilities and we're building the infrastructure here to deal with a lot of the stuff that's happening in town.
Okay, thanks for that. Last point from you?
Yeah, just another thing that's kind of come up this week. I think all of council received a letter from the swim club that utilizes the outdoor pool, and there's concerns around it not opening this summer, which I have no insight into at all. But if there is reopening costs, I know the reason we didn't open it was COVID related, and perhaps we should give some consideration if there's, you know, some upgrades that need to happen similar to City Hall. Maybe we could allocate some of these monies that way.
Yeah, maybe I'll just add that that's something the staff has already started to talk about. We typically open that pool or start that work around May. Of course, there's recruiting for lifeguards and there's all that soft cost in behind that we start actually fairly soon doing. The rec managers have started that process in anticipation of potentially utilizing some operational funds to do what's necessary to get that pool open. We know there's a lot of pressure and a lot of intent and a lot of people want to use that pool, so.
Okay, that's great. Thanks.
Okay, and Jennifer, last
Sure.
comment?
Yeah, I was just going to add, if that's something that comes up and we require those funds, we could, within that $200,000, we could, you know, we could do 100,000 for more of the unexpected, and we could slave off 100,000 for other facility reopen or something like that, if you feel that's something you'd like to see.
Well, I just really like us being able to throw around these numbers and say, yeah, we'll just use 100,000 for that. But thanks very much, and I wanted to thank you for all the work that's gone into this report. I think it's very thoughtful and comprehensive. I'm thinking that an endorsement from this committee would be appropriate for this to be brought forward to council. Mr. Richta, do you think that's wise? Okay, so we'll take a motion to endorse the recommendations in the report on the use of COVID-19 Safe Start grants.
So moved.
Second.
Any discussion on that? All in favor? Unanimous, and we'll look forward to this being presented at a future council meeting. Thanks, Jennifer. And we'll move along to the next item, which is the information sheet related to the gaming fund. And that's on page 15 of our agenda. And Jennifer, we'll turn it back to you on this again.
Okay, thank you. So you'll recall last year this committee reviewed in detail our gaming fund spending matrix. We went over a few options, and there was lots of time put into coming up with a spending pattern over the next few years. And then, of course, COVID hit in the early new year and significantly impacted our gaming revenue. So we really need to come back and take a look at this spending matrix for the upcoming budget. As well as in November, Council passed a resolution to have a look at funding our two RCMP officers out of gaming. So that also prompted a review of this gaming matrix. So what I've done here is I've brought back 3 options again for the committee to take a look at. I assumed when I was developing this that you would hopefully endorse the recommendation on the restart fund, so in terms of paying back the fund. So that's great. So what that does is that puts us in a position that council can continue on with their preferred funding approach from the gaming fund by paying it back. Now, hopefully, the casinos will reopen in 2021 and we'll start to see that revenue stream flow back in. So we assumed that will be taking place late within 2021. So what I've done is I've brought back the original approved matrix, and maybe what I'll do is I'll just walk through the attachments with you and then give you an idea of what we've done and then open it up for discussion. So page is that 18 of the agenda is just attachment 1, and that is the original approved gaming fund matrix for 2020 to 2023. And you can see, based on the work that was done, we were always trying to only spend the previous year's revenue and maintain at least $1 million balance within this fund. So then again, if you look at the next page, which is page 19, attachment 2, what I've done is I've taken your approved spending matrix. I've recognized the losses within the fund in 2021 or 2020 and 2021, assuming that it's the same, that we're both in both years we're losing $750,000 of revenue, and just kept the spending pattern the same. So just so it highlights the loss that, you know, we can't maintain that spending pattern. We have to take another look at this fund in order to move forward. So that's just really illustrating that. The next page is where we begin looking at options to select from in terms of what this committee would support for incorporating into our budget coming up, our financial plan. So this option, what it does is it just identifies paying back the fund for 2 years of loss. So reinstating it and then just continuing on the same pattern of spending that you previously approved, but also acknowledging that 2020 and 2021's grant and aid program is not taking place because council passed a resolution in mid-2020 not to continue with the program just for during the pandemic while the gaming funds were unknown. So essentially it's the same spending pattern. And ultimately, with using these restart funds to pay the fund back, we maintain over that 5 years, we maintain $1 million balance and we continue on with the previous program as normal. The following page, page 21 of the agenda, is option 2. And essentially, it's the same as the previous option. The only difference is we've gone and reduce the funding for the policing contract by $100,000 a year to ultimately not rely on gaming any further to fund the 2 police officers. But what that does do is it pumps up the balance in the gaming fund to almost $2 million at the end of 5 years, with all other spending being the same. But it does shift the burden onto the general taxation. And so ultimately, you know, $100,000 a year has approximately about a 0.4% tax increase to consider. So that's option 2. And the last option on the next page, again, is same strategy, paying back with the restart funds, all other spending the same across the 5 years. However, we've reduced the annual funding for the policing contract by $50,000 per year. So just reducing that amount to have a smaller impact on the general fund over the 5 years to reduce that amount each year. And ultimately, at the end of the day, the gaming fund balance had approximately $1.5 million after 5 years. So just a few options to consider, and I'll just open it up for questions from the committee.
Okay, so just to clarify, you're looking for us to recommend a preferred option to take forward to council, and essentially the difference is to what extent we shift some of the policing costs from coming from gaming into general taxation. That's really the key issue.
Yeah, so looking for an option so that we can build that into our financial planning process. So yes, one of the main ones that really impacts that is the policing support, as well as getting, well, we already got that direction from the committee on paying back the fund in 2020. So ultimately, really that's the decision to be made here, is how much we want to change that funding pattern, and as well as just supporting the rest of the, you know, we're still endorsing that same pattern of spending if there's any other questions or
Sure.
changes the committee may want to consider.
Sure. And just before we dive into that, I'm noticing the time, and I should have checked at the start in terms of people's commitments and how long people are okay to stay here. Does anybody have a pressing need to wrap this up fairly quickly, either from a staff or council perspective?
I think it's scheduled till one, isn't it? Or
No, it was 1 hour till 12.
It was scheduled till
okay.
12, but we
Oh, I
did
didn't
start a
realize.
little late, so
That's
I
correct.
think we'll
Yeah.
we'll see if we can wrap up by about 12:15 if that works for people.
Okay, I had it longer in my calendar, so.
Uh-huh. Okay, Trevor, did you want to make some
Yeah.
comments?
Yeah, thank you, Chair Hilling. Just a quick comment that we know that staff haven't made that, pardon me, council has not made that decision regarding reducing the use of gaming funds for policing, but we knew that it was something that was going to want to be talked about. We thought it was appropriate for him to have that discussion here.
Sure.
And that's why Jennifer has shown the three options for that.
Sure. Oh, maybe we could start at this end this time with Councillor Cole Hamilton, and we'll move around.
Sure, thank you, Chair. As I was looking at the patterns, I was noticing, of course, that the reductions of 50,000 and 100,000 continue each year upon year. So it ends up being that 0.4, I think it's for 100,000, it's 0.4, but that would be compounded over the series of 4 years. And so while it does really bolster our gaming reserves, it, you know, it's going to move a fairly considerable amount to the general taxation fund. And I'm wondering, we'd had the idea of it remaining at roughly $1 million or over $1 million. What we would gain by increasing it to either roughly 1.5 or in the other scenario almost 2 million over the course of those years. And I guess my other follow-up would be whether perhaps something smaller, like say 25,000 a year over the course of 4 years, which by my not very advanced math would seem to sort of stabilize the fund, so it wouldn't be decreasing, it would be staying roughly stable. And I was wondering, I guess, what the benefit is to increasing the reserve to 1.5 or 2, and what the possibility would be of just stabilizing it with going at 25,000 a year over the course of 4 years reductions.
So the only advantage to doing this, I mean, we're assuming gaming's going to come back. That's the hope, right? So the only advantage is that you could use it for something else. So it's there, and if you wanted to use it in other ways, then you can certainly do that. I just picked 50 and 100 as a way to kind of follow the resolution, but certainly it would be upon council's decision to do any amount they wish. So 25,000 would be completely appropriate if that is what the committee wanted to. I could update another option, or if that's the direction that we're going in, we could provide another option of that too.
Just yeah, I'd certainly appreciate some proper math rather than my own personal things of trying to figure it out on a calculator math as to what 25,000 would look like. But
And I'll speak to it when it's my turn, just because.
Why don't you go ahead now?
Yeah, because I think really the important reason is why are we even talking about this, and it just so happens we're talking about this a year into a pandemic, but the reason I brought this forward in the first place is because it was unreliable funding. It's funding that is not guaranteed. It's funding that really is, and I can't remember. Jennifer, you might know, like the contract, I can't remember if it's year to year or every 3 years, but it's you know, sort of 10%, I think, of revenues from the local gaming center. And looking at other municipalities, many other municipalities don't use it for operating costs. They really don't want to. And again, this is conversations from years ago, but the idea was you didn't want to be in a situation where if that funding was removed for some reason, that now you have to backfill it somehow in short order. That was before the pandemic. Now that we're in the pandemic, we can actually see how it affects us. And so for me, it's a stronger argument of saying, you know, if we have these funds and they're not used for general operating purposes, say for RCMP, then what that allows, like what that extra funding allows us to do is actually sort of shift it to more council priorities. And so that might be putting extra funding towards, say, a bridge resurfacing, or a multimodal bridge, or cycling infrastructure, or purchasing property. Like there's other things that I think, or even, because part of the funding already is towards infrastructure or asset management. Like there's other things that are important, but some of those other things, if the casino's closed for a year, those things can be postponed. But the RCMP, they're gonna give us a bill, you know, like that, and that's really for me the difference, and the reason why I was really wanting to put forward this idea when soon after the election, but why even now into the pandemic, it just reinforces for me how important this is, that we put ourselves in as stable of a situation, because again, a lot of assumptions in here, and I don't even, like, I'm not gonna jump up and down, I don't think about how we sort of transition, whether that's $100,000 a year or even $25,000 a year. It's really just having that path, because this is a pandemic that, from what the experts are saying, might be over in a year, might be over in 6 months, but it's kind of unknown as new strains are coming along. And then a year, 5, 10 years down the road, there may be something else that impacts us. And it could be a pandemic, but it could be something else as well.
Yeah, thanks for those
Yeah,
points,
sorry, I
Trevor.
know we got a timeline.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I just want to, for a point of clarity, the report assumes in 2021 a Q4 or a quarter year of revenue. That obviously coincides with the vaccinations and what our Prime Minister says, that everyone will be hopefully done by September, but who knows what happens. So, and that's, frankly, that's even assuming that the casino goers go back to the casino right away for a full quarter year of revenue. So it's conservative, but it could very well, to the mayor's point, it could very well be none, or it could be a half or an eighth of that revenue. We just don't know.
Well, if I was a betting man, I would bet on the casino users flocking back.
Yeah. There's some pent-up demand.
But, Councillor McCollum.
Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly take the point that, you know, strategically speaking, maybe it is a better way to approach funds that are revenue that's not guaranteed, in a way that doesn't have it a 5-year plan for spending it forward. I certainly get the rationale, but I mean, if we're going to go down that path, arguably the $225,000 that we allocate to supporting downtown arts and culture would fall into that category too. So I'm honestly not sure where I land on it. Yeah, one of the questions I had, I suppose, is for Jennifer. Our police budget in 2020 was increased because we were anticipating vacancies being filled, and I imagine the pandemic may have railroaded that. Do you have any insight into what's happened with that?
I still haven't received the last quarter bill from them. Their vacancy rate seem to be decreasing that gap. So I do see that they are filling that. There are some other additional costs coming down the pipe from relating to the RCMP contract. There's some unsettled severance and retro pay that they've been working on as well. And we do accrue for that anticipated cost each year, but some of the latest correspondence that I've received is that those numbers seem to keep increasing. So I'm not anticipating that we're going to, at the end of 2020, we're going to have a significant surplus with the RCMP. Again, I'm waiting for those figures to come in, but they do appear to be narrowing that gap of that we were budgeting.
So likely the budget for policing for 2021 will be the same, or maybe slightly more than it was for 2021. It's not gonna.
Yeah. So based on the approval in principle, it's the same vacancy rate that we're still anticipating. So I see us, because of the wage increases that come along with the contract, there's still going to be increases in policing, and I believe it was in the range of just over 1% already. We're looking at just to cover the cost of the contract and those wage increases within it. So
I suppose my follow-up question is, imagining that we go on the, farthest end of this scenario where we're building it towards $2 million, and even going further, that we're phasing out using these funds to fund operations. What would be the mechanism for deciding if we're choosing to fund things that come up on a yearly basis, or not even necessarily yearly? Like, for example, had we not been doing it this way and we had, $3 million in this reserve and we're looking at the pedestrian bridge, would that be a resolution by council, or would that be something that comes out of the budget process, or how do you imagine it switching out of this operational framework into something else?
So when you say operational, like this committee
Well,
framework?
just, I mean, sorry.
Like how you
that
could
it's
use.
funding operations, and that we would be basically
Yeah.
building up a pot of money to dole out to projects, I think is,
Right.
kind of a loose way of,
Yeah, so what I would recommend is we wait till gaming's reestablished, we see revenue coming in, okay, the fund is starting to build, and then again, we would look at a process like this, and you could either modify some of these, or it's sitting there and it is available for when there are those one-off projects that come up, or through the budget process as a funding mechanism, but it would have to be council resolution regardless for us to make any payment out of the gaming fund. So it's either very clearly laid out and adopted within the budget. Anything above and beyond that, again, it would be a report and a council resolution that would allow for any payments out of the gaming fund. It's pretty strict on that, so.
okay. But like theoretically, we could change our approach to how we're spending this revenue and say, something comes out of the downtown playbook and we want to build like a plaza. It could be used to fund like a capital expense or something like that, or a community art project, or something
Yeah.
that's different than what we're doing now.
Yeah, so assuming that balance was there, I mean, there are no restrictions in what you can use those funds for. So yes, if that was something that council chose to do, we would do that. We could do that. We could fund a project like that using gaming.
Okay.
Mayor Wallace?
Well, I was just going to give two examples that might, solidify, because I think Jennifer sort of nailed everything, but in previous budgets, Councillor Hillian has actually said, let's take some of the gaming funds and put it towards asset management. And so that's right, you sort of, baked into the budget process. But then when the pandemic hit last year, we said we want to put, I think it was $15,000 or $20,000 directly into some of the nonprofits, and so that was just a resolution of council, and a check was issued. So yeah, and I think, again, and it's not that there's a right way of doing it, but if it's hard for me, because I see if those funds are available either for large projects or for those one-offs, then it's just not as tied up, and policing just is such a large portion of it, and every year it becomes a larger portion, and that's just my concern with policing in particular.
Yeah, I might comment that my preference would be that we hold the line right now, because we're in an uncertain time. We're also looking at contract negotiation this year, which I don't know what the impact that's going to be on our budget. We're already getting messages from the public about potential tax increases in a time when a lot of people are hurting. And so it strikes me that if we have the COVID funds to replenish our gaming, that we perhaps put this decision about moving policing costs back into general revenue, that we put that off down the line, and try to maintain the steady course for now until, as you say, we see whether gaming does in fact recover. The lure of increasing our discretionary spending is a strong one. But I think we would find a divided public around whether we go that route or not. So. So I don't know if we're at the point where we want to make a recommendation, or if we simply want to take this to council to have this as an expanded discussion with us having had a bit of a head start on it. What's people's thoughts on that?
I would support taking this to council, and I'd just ask perhaps to include the $25,000 a year amount as well, to sort of give something which is perhaps halfway between what you're talking about, holding the line and making some of the more substantial reductions here. So if that could be added, then I'd support it going to council.
Any other thoughts?
I take your point really seriously, and I don't begrudge that at all. Like I said, for me, I see where we're at right now, and holding the line I don't see as necessarily a negative thing. And even if we look at those numbers, I'm just happy we're having the discussion, honestly, and having this information in front of us, and look at the will of council and say, okay, is this something that we want to start to look at? And once we look at the budget, and we look at what those increases might look like this year, this might be something during that discussion to say, you know, we have this information, but maybe this isn't the year to really start that process. And
Jennifer?
I was just going to suggest that, you know, maybe what we do is this committee endorses the option 1, which is the status quo, just for bringing into the budget. And then through the budget process, we could give a couple of alternatives of what would happen to the tax impact with a couple of scenarios around the gaming, or sorry, the policing contract if it were shifting. So then that way we can at least sort of move along with pulling the budget together, and we have a gaming option to work with, but that we could let council have that discussion through budgeting, giving some information at that point.
That makes sense. I think we've got concurrence on that.
Yeah.
And do you need a resolution, or are you okay with accepting council's consent or committee's consensus in that?
I've got what I need. I can move ahead.
Fair enough. I did just have one other question. There's a couple of items on the list. I don't know whether the Purple Ribbon campaign still actually happens or not, and I'm wondering if we should reference the Transition Society around that. We used to have an annual presentation in relation to that, and a fair amount of publicity. I don't think it's happened in the last couple of years, and it may be something that we can knock off the list here. A relatively small amount, but it all makes a difference. I don't know if there's any of the other items there that need to be reconsidered, but that was the one that came to my attention.
Sure, yeah. So I believe that was a resolution of council years ago, and it was an ongoing commitment that was made. And I know they do reach out for that payment. So
Do they? Okay.
fair enough. Maybe we should have them
That's
come
a
and
pretty
present.
good
and-
indicator.
Yeah,
But,
perhaps it is a conversation we could have, and you know, I'm certainly willing to reach out to Heather Ney and clarify with her.
okay,
Yeah.
sure.
Okay. All right. So we want to move along and get folks off to their lunches. So we'll go to the next item on our agenda, which is the correspondence from the regional district. And I believe all we need to do is receive this, or is there some action that's required, Jennifer? And this is on page 23.
Yeah, I can jump in.
Trevor?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Yeah, this is just some information. It's a good example of how they reported out, how they're using their funds, and I suspect that after we move through the budget process, we'll do the same as well.
Great. Any questions or comment in relation to that?
Do you need a receipt motion?
Sure, we'll have a receipt motion.
Move receipt.
And a seconder?
There's only 1 second.
That's right. Any discussion? All in favor? Carried. Great. But this complete package will go to council, and we may want to think a little bit more on some of these examples to help inform that discussion. So the final item is under new business is the terms of reference and mandate for the committee. You'll recall that we were full of hope and promise last February, and we're going to report back and have our mandate expire at the end of this month, assuming that we had a year of work under our belts. That obviously didn't happen. And so I think we need to just clarify if we feel that there's merit in the continued operation of this committee. And if so, we need to bring a resolution to council proposing that that mandate be moved forward. And I'm wondering if staff are suggesting that we go with a year again to January 31st of 2022. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that would be my recommendation.
Councillor Collins?
Yeah, I was gonna say, I'd be happy to move that. It strikes me that there are a lot of moving parts going to be happening in the next 12 months, and it'd be useful to be meeting over the course of that time period. So if I move as CEO Kushner suggests.
So the motion would be to recommend to council that the Finance Select Committee's terms of reference and mandate be modified to last until January 31st, 2022.
Second.
Any discussion or comment? And does staff have any sense of what we might be looking at in terms of frequency of meetings or means of bringing initiatives forward? I realize up to this point it's primarily work that staff has initiated and we show up and do our part, but you know, I don't know whether we want to do anything further in terms of brainstorming some of the issues and other possible remedies so that ideas that council may have can be brought to the table.
Yeah, maybe I'll just add, Chair, that Jennifer and I spoke about that. We know that capacity is going to be pretty tight over the next couple of months because of the budget process. I think once we get through that process, then we can really start working on some of the core work that really was the impetus behind the Finance Select Committee. So I would suggest probably around April, May discussions. Yeah, that'd be appropriate.
Sounds good. All right, all those in favor? Unanimous. And with that, we do have an agenda item for roundtable or committee initiatives, which is to a certain extent what I just alluded to. Does anybody have anything pressing or burning that they want to comment on? All right, well, I'll just thank everyone once again for being here today, for the work involved, and in particular to all the staff that have made this meeting happen and the work that led up to it. And we'll look forward to continued opportunity to work together through hopefully a better year. And with that, we'll call the